This morning, we want to look at media and how we shape the African narrative. Media plays both a good, positive, and also a not so positive role. It amplifies the good, but also sometimes mainly the bad. It reinforces stereotypes. It promotes hate and prejudice. Not to remember Rwanda 1994 and Kenya as well, back in the way. And yet, it is also a partner in development. So this morning, we just want to bring media into focus with the help of some expert panelists whom I'm going to call on board in a moment to see how we put our thoughts together and how we can advance that conversation from beyond just, hey, who's telling our story, to how do we own that story and tell it ourselves. And the aim here is, as I mentioned at the beginning, to look beyond the general discussion about the shaping of the African narrative to what can we do to move that discussion forward in practical terms. And I'm going to ask very basic questions. Who is telling the story of Africa? What exactly is told about Africa? How is it told? Is Africa involved in the telling of this story? What tools are used to tell this story? That's part one of my discussion. And then the second part, which is the most important, how do we shift the balance so that the story is told differently? And in doing so, I'm remembering the late Nigerian author Chinua Achebe, who told us that until the lions have their own historians, the history of the hunt will always glorify the hunter. So we'd like to shift that balance.
Thank you very much, Joseph. And thank you to the audience. The question of telling Africa's story. The question you began with, who is telling Africa's story? Africa's story, as it is told, as we hear it on the media, mainly international media, and we in Africa, we consume international media or the products of international media more than we consume those of local media. So international media are very prominent in telling Africa's story or in communicating to the world about Africa and informing the world about what Africa is about and what Africans are about. But over and above the media, there is also academia. A great deal of the information we have about Africa, and also a great deal of the information we Africans have about ourselves, actually comes from foreign academics, but also foreign media. Now, why is this? This is because foreign media are very well funded. They are very well resourced. They have great reach. They reach parts of the African continent that local media cannot reach. I have had conversations with colleagues of mine in media in both Rwanda and Uganda about how it is that they do not send journalists to go and cover stories in other African countries. And the response is always, we can't afford it. We don't have the resources to do it. Foreign media are very well funded. They have great reach, correspondents all over the continent. And so they tell us what is happening around Africa. And what we think we know about ourselves comes from what they're telling us. The same thing happens with foreign academics. Our universities in Africa are not that well funded. We therefore do not have sufficient reach as African academics. When I was a graduate student, I remember that we were preoccupied by this, the African students I was with, which was that we, the Africans studying in London at the time, we were going to complete our studies and come back to Africa and study our own societies. So you return to your country, Rwanda or Uganda or Kenya, and you become an expert on Kenya or Uganda or Rwanda. Our colleagues from Western countries were going to travel around and become experts on your own country and on all the neighboring countries and others, and pretty much act as if they can even teach you about your own country. Now, this is a function of what our universities are like. They are not well funded. We don't have enough money to do research or resources to go and study other countries. Now, I view myself as being in a unique position in the sense that I live in two countries, Rwanda and Uganda, and therefore I can claim some expertise on two countries, but most academics of my generation, they don't go beyond the countries they work in. And so what I know about Tanzania or Namibia or South Africa comes from external sources. Now, how accurate are these sources? I tend to argue that you do not get to know a country very well until you have lived there for a long time, or until you visit very regularly and talk to people who make decisions, as well as those who are very well informed. Now, how many of our colleagues who write about us live in these countries they write about? How many visit regularly enough and talk to the people who make decisions so that they can claim genuinely to be experts, if we were to take the word expert seriously? I think that some do. But I read a great lot of things about Rwanda, which I know very well, and about Uganda, which I know very well, which are actually misrepresentations, or partial understandings of reality. And this has to do with the fact that people come in for a few weeks, a few months, they talk to people, and then they go away and they claim to know more than they do. Now, that really is the problem, that we will not be able to tell our own stories until we have the means and the capacity, first of all, to extend our reach so that we Africans can study other African countries. If it is media, we will never be able to tell our own story until we have African media that are well-resourced, both financial and in terms of human resources, to be able to go into other parts of Africa and tell us what's there. So I'll leave it at that for now.
The media is essential in the pursuit of security, because as it has been said before, it can be a source of insecurity and it can be a source of stabilization. The issue about African perspective, the African media can be a tool for stability if it has an African perspective. It can be a tool for instability if it lacks an African perspective. Where do perspectives come from? I think that's something that is worth spending time on, because until we understand where perspectives come from, we'll be able to know whether we're having an African perspective or another perspective. Where do perspectives come from? And if we don't know where perspectives come from, then we don't know whether the media is a tool for stability or for instability. Now, there's something I read on Twitter the other day, and someone was asking that should we teach our students to believe in a better world, or should we teach them to survive in this one? So the media, as it is today, and how the African media is shaped, it is like religion. So we Africans have become very good at Christianity or Islam, and they are better than the people who taught them these religions, and they are better at the theory of it. Should we of the better world, not the world as it is. So if we talk about the media with the world as it is, we can see how where Africans are learning best practices about the media, it is used domestically to manufacture consent, to seek consent. It is used as a tool to seek stability. It's used as a tool to galvanize consensus. And abroad, the media is used as a tool in pursuit of geostrategic interests. Now, if you look at African media, the practice, not the practice, the theory of the media and journalism tells us about the significance of objectivity, independence, truth first. This is the better world. But this practical world, the world to survive, the practice of the media is a far cry from these ideals. It is about these practical aspects, about stability, about pursuit of geostrategic interests. When it comes to Africa, this better world comes first. The practical aspect is forgotten. Rarely do you see the media as a tool for pursuing stability. Africans are told that the media is a tool for checking your government. You know, until you are antagonistic with the authorities, you are not doing good media. But this is not what is happening from where the Africans are learning media. Africans are not projecting their geostrategic interests through the media. So we are coming back to the question: does the African media have an African perspective? I think I'm suggesting that that perspective is missing in the way the African media practices, because it is engaging in the utopia. It's in a pursuit of utopia. It is engaging in the religion where the life, the good life, comes when you are dead, you know, in heaven, not on earth. You don't. The pursuit of so you be good, and you wait for the good things in the afterlife. So there's something wrong. There's something wrong about the media as it is theorized, or what it ought to be, and how its practice is, and the utility, its purpose is missing when it comes to the African. When it comes to other societies, the utility of the media is apparent. Of what purpose is the media? And until we understand the purpose for the media, we will not understand where the perspective should come from, and we will not understand whose perspective our media is pursuing, and it will be a chase. the media, African media, will remain neither here nor there. It's existing somewhere, suspended, and we are not sure whether it is of value or significance to our societies. And until we understand that, even the question of financing, because you invest in something that is of value to you. So until we understand that the media is important for our security, the media is important for our stability, the media is important for our geostrategic interests, the media is with the African perspective. Until we understand that, even if we had money for the media, it will be useless. It will be throwing away good money. It will not be money well spent.
So, Dr. Ruggiero, because I know you're a practitioner yourself.
Thank you.
I want to come back to some of your own thoughts from a practitioner's point of view, even beyond your scholarship. But let me pause you for a moment and turn to Arthur Asimwe. You're on the hot seat, running an important institution, the RBA. What are your broad thoughts?
Thank you, Joseph. I'm happy to be part of this panel this morning. And I think, in all fairness, I think we should have switched roles. Because you worked at the BBC for a long time, you're the African editor for the BBC, you should be the one telling us where we've gotten it wrong in telling the African story. But definitely give us your insights. Now, I don't want to start the morning by whining and crying that the African story has not been told, or the African media is weak. I think in all its means and modesty, the African media has tried to do its job. Of course, with the difficulties, the challenge of resources. But I don't want to really sit here this morning and I whine that the African media has failed the African continent. No. I think there are so many good examples out here on the continent, in our country, where media is playing a significant and good role in the society. But I want to look at this issue from a different perspective, not from the traditional media that you're used to, the traditional mainstream media. I want to look at it from the arts and creative industry. And I think this is where we need to put a lot of attention as Africans. And the African continent has, in my view, failed to invest heavily in the arts and creative industry. I'll give an example. Apart from, I think, Nigeria. Nigeria has tried a lot. But you know Nigeria, the arts industry is the second biggest source of employment after agriculture in Nigeria. And it's attracting a lot of money. But why am I saying that? You see, there's something called Hollywood that can make or create magic. We have been, for the past 1 year, we have had a guest in this country called Rusa Savagina, whose story was written in the mainstream print media by one Philip Gorovich for the first time. I'm sure none of you in this room even remembers about that article that Philip wrote several years ago. He was the first guy to mention about a guy in a hotel in Kigali who tried to save lives. It was in the mainstream media. But among us here, there's hardly anyone who can quote that story. Nobody remembers that story. It was written and passed. But the arts and creative industry, in the name of Hollywood, picked an interest in that small story that was run some time back and created a movie that we all know. Now, when you go to Tokyo, when you go to Alaska, when you go to Soweto, people probably know Hotel Rwanda than they know our commander-in-chief. That's the African story, the sad bit of it. That we have failed to strategically look at the arts and creative industry as a big source of amplifying the African story. So Hollywood goes and picks something, builds fiction around it, becomes huge, that everybody believes this is a true story. Yet we all know the truth. So I want to bring up that example just to show you how the African narrative, the African story should not only be seen through the mainstream, BBC, CNN, Al Jazeera, but how do we think strategically as the African continent to invest in this soft power, the arts and creative industry? I mean, do we have a national theater? Are there, filmmaking schools? Yet when these stories hit our screens, when they hit Netflix, they become massive and they change the narrative. So I think we really need to rethink about how do you tell the African story beyond the traditional BBCs, the traditional RBAs that we know. And Nigeria, despite its own political challenges, at least the other story of Nigeria is being told through Nollywood that we see every day. So we need to think serious about it and stop whining about the absence of strong mainstream media. The second thing I wanted to bring, and I think Dr. Lonzen and Dr. Grover touched on it, and I want to relate it to what you people are studying here, is of course media and national security. We all agree that, for the last 27 years I've been in this country, I've not had a bullet. For the last 27 years, I've not had a bullet. Maybe you here, you're lucky, you might be going for shooting practice and you get the sound of a bullet, but I've not had the sound of a bullet here. But the war that we are fighting today, which every morning I get a lot of lambasting, is out there in the media. It's out there in what we call the new media. There is a war of propaganda and disinformation. So how do we get to fight this war? It's a question that I have not found a solution to. We don't own the means, we don't own YouTube, we don't own Facebook, we don't own, these are all run by our friends in Silicon Valley. But this is a serious national security threat. A story is turned around to serve a particular propaganda interest. And at times, it even becomes difficult for you to respond or try to answer to these things, because some of these issues are extremely outrageous, hopeless, useless, that you find that even responding to them is an issue. But a poor peasant deep in the villages of Musanze will come across it and take it as a truth. So, a college like this one, where your concern is about national security issues, I think the biggest threat we have today is not a military threat. Of course, it might be there. But the biggest problem you have today is new media that is serving a propaganda agenda that is a new serious security threat to us. And the answer is not we in the media only who are supposed to answer this issue. The answer also is in your hands as military experts. So that's what I want to say. Thank you.
My first point would be write for the foreign audience. If Rwandans feel passionately about a topic and only write for other Rwandans, they have no one to blame but themselves if the foreign audience doesn't understand their message. Editors in the United States and elsewhere want good content. And I say this as an editor myself. Editors can be lazy. I'd much rather get a piece submitted to me that's 95% right in terms of style, in terms of length, than get a piece that's 20,000 words and I can't make heads or tails of it. What I always tell my students who feel very passionately about various subjects is always write in your article 1 point. You may have 20 points to make, but then if you try to make 20 points in an article, it's going to get ignored. 1 point, and if you have 20 points to make, write 20 articles. The other point I would make, and this is important, is that Twitter is not a representative audience. If I can give one analogy from American politics, in the run-up to the Democratic presidential nomination, which ultimately former Vice President, now President Biden won, many of the candidates were focused on Twitter, and they pivoted to be much more left-wing than the regular American audience was. President Biden stayed consistent and recognized that mainstream opinion was not the same as what occurred on Twitter, and therefore it can be tempting to engage in Twitter, but ultimately Twitter becomes a cesspool and a suck of time. Now, another point I would make is to attack ideas, but don't attack people. The late US Supreme Court Justice, Anthony Scalia, was famous for saying, "I attack ideas, I don't attack people, because some very good people have very bad ideas." And let me give you one analogy, because my specialty isn't Rwanda. I focus most of my time on the Middle East, on Turkey, on the South Caucasus. There was a cocktail party, and someone introduced an American journalist who had written critically about the Armenians to the head of one of the Armenian lobby groups in the United States, introduced themselves and suggested that they have coffee sometime. And the Armenian lobbyist turned to this journalist whom he wasn't happy with and said, "How do you live with yourself? What's wrong with you?" Well, that's one coffee that never happened. The goal of meeting isn't just to talk to people with whom you agree, but to actually convince those with whom you disagree that you are right without causing them to lose face in a way which will mean that they dig in on issues of personal honor rather than on wanting to do the right thing. And while some people are clearly corrupted, there are other people who simply don't know. One of the most powerful Rwandan stories which I saw, against the backdrop of recent press, appeared, I guess, in the New Times, and it was an interview with one of the Rwandan survivors of a terrorist attack in the south of the country. Well, that certainly gave a new perspective to some of the narrative, one-sided narrative, which was coming through in the United States. I only wish that that reminiscence of what happened to this woman's husband, who was a school teacher in the South, was read in the Washington Post or the New York Times instead of just in the New Times in Rwanda, so that it would better reach the foreign audience. Journalists don't like criticism, but sometimes you do have to criticize when they get it wrong. The important thing here, though, are resources. On the Israel-Palestine situation, one of the most effective resources is a website called camera.org, the Committee for Accuracy on Reporting in the Middle East, or something like that. And it's a very dispassionate look at various press accounts, and it explains in a very factual way why the journalists got it wrong, or what the journalist omitted. And the metric which they use for their success is the number of corrections which get printed to news articles. Well, the point here is once a journalist makes a mistake that is forced to have a correction, they're not going to make that mistake again. They may be operating simply because they don't know enough, and where I would disagree with one of the previous speakers is that we're in an age of retraction of resources, even among Western correspondents. And therefore, many people are writing from afar, and it's not like in the 70s or 80s where the Associated Press or United Press International had stringers or correspondents in every capital. Again, I emphasize, assume ignorance and not malevolence. One example for myself. I wrote an article for the National Interest looking at the nature of the anti-Tutsi genocide and why it wasn't recognized specifically in terms of being an anti-Tutsi genocide in much of the writing in the West. It was. And then it came out with the headline, Rwanda Genocide. One of the biggest frustrations of writers is that they're not the ones who choose their headlines. And fortunately, I was able to get the editor of that magazine on the phone within 10 minutes and get it corrected. But he's not going to make that mistake again. That said, he wasn't doing it because he was a bad person. He was doing it simply because he didn't understand. He didn't know. I would extend this to American policy as I wind up. The average age of staff in the US Congress is something like 22 or 23 years old, out of college. What do they know? And ultimately what I would say is that policymakers, congressmen, editors can be lazy. They would much rather have a whole story put in front of them rather than simply get a tweet. They would rather have an explainer, a sheet or a resource that explains everything, because they can't be instant experts in everything. And the last point I would make is just be very, very careful of the Pyrrhic victory. That sometimes the timing of a news story could look deliberate or could look provocative. And this can happen, for example, with outlets like Voice of America. But sometimes it's just the nature of journalism. Sometimes it's just timing. And sometimes the net benefit would be to just let it go or to quietly explain why this was insensitive, rather than make a bigger issue in which the story then becomes repression of journalism, rather than ensuring that journalists do the right thing and are sensitive to all the nuances, because as we said before, increasingly, especially among Westerners, we parachute in for just a day or two and then think we're instant experts. If I can just give one very quick anecdote in conclusion. I was on CNN, I think it was, and I was giving my 20 seconds of wisdom about Afghanistan. I came back to the green room, the waiting room afterwards, and there was a governor from a state who was going to be talking about healthcare next. And he had all of his aides with him. And one of his aides said, "You know, you look good up there," to me. And I said, "That's kind of funny because my wife just texted me and said, 'Michael, I thought you looked fat, bald, and mean.'" And the governor looked up from his notes and said, "No, I didn't think you looked mean." The point of that is no matter how mean I may or may not look, I really look forward to hardball questions, no red lines. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. Now that we know where all the panelists stand on this issue, it's time to get into the real discussion. And I'd like to start, maybe just before you do, I think your point about Twitter is really, it was driven home in Kenya a few years ago in an election when a very strong woman candidate who stood a really good chance focused all her efforts on Twitter, and she lost badly. And the comment from someone on Twitter, Madam so-and-so, there are no polling stations on Twitter. So in other words, you are speaking to the wrong audience. So let's look at the role, and I want to turn to you, Golobal, looking at the role of leadership in shaping narrative. And I want to give an example of Tanzania. I've been following very closely President Samia Suluhu Hassan. Even before she assumed the leadership of the ruling CCM party, one of her first actions was to unban media that had been banned. In other words, to open up the space for media. And she had good reasons for that. But my reading for that situation was that she wants to reshape the story of Tanzania. And she needs media to walk with her on that journey. So my question to you is, what role does leadership play in helping to reshape the narrative?
That's a difficult one. I think if you're talking about reshaping the narrative or reshaping a narrative about a country, I can see very easily what leadership has to do. And I think that creating a mutually respectful relationship with media is where to start. I was going to say harmonious, but then I thought harmonious relationship between media and leaders, not where I come from. But a mutually respectful relationship where leaders take media seriously and take their mistakes for what they are. As Mr. Rubin said, that sometimes we possibly think that journalists are incapable of making mistakes, that even when they write the wrong things, they're just being mean. But yeah, I think that there are times when they make genuine mistakes. But from also Rwanda and Uganda, which I know very well, sometimes misreporting is simply the product of mutual antagonism, that journalists will write things because they are angry about the people they are writing about. And they will not bother to check or to nuance whatever they are writing. And then that creates antagonism on the other side. So eventually what happens is a relationship that is really built on mutual antagonism. But if we are talking about reshaping the narrative about Africa, I struggle to see where leadership comes in. I think what we need is something else. And this takes me back to the point I made earlier, that shaping the narrative about Africa without us Africans participating in it directly is not going to happen. And I would like to give you a simple example of something that happened about 2 years ago. Everything that I knew about Eritrea came from Western media. I heard a lot about Eritrea on the BBC. I read about Eritrea in all the major Western newspapers. And I never heard or read a single positive thing about that country. Not a single one. Either it was Isaias the monster who is oppressing his people, then you read about these guys crossing the Mediterranean, and nothing positive. Now, one time I'm attending the annual conference of the Africa Studies Association in Washington. I go to a session where they are discussing Eritrea. And even academics are hammering away at Eritrea. Nothing positive. 2 hours of discussion, negative, negative, negative. So I asked, what kind of country is Eritrea where nothing good happens? Where nothing positive at all happens? So that everything you hear about Eritrea, whether it's from academics or media, is bad, 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 negative stuff. So anyway, to cut the long story short, I made my way to Asmara at some point. I just decided I wanted to go to Asmara and see Eritrea and talk to Eritreans and talk to Eritrean leaders and try to understand what kind of country is Eritrea. Now I can tell you that I came out of Eritrea feeling extremely angry. And I was angry about all the stuff that I had read about Eritrea and believed. Because a lot of what I had read about Eritrea, some of it was accurate, because Eritrea is not a paradise, there are problems there. But there are so many things that happen in Eritrea, which I think are very good things that the rest of us in Africa should know about, but which no one tells us about. Absolutely no one. So how do you reshape the narrative about Eritrea, about Africa, and what I am describing about Eritrea is the same thing that I could say about Zimbabwe under Mugabe. Because again, Mugabe was doing some nasty things, but the story was not nuanced adequately for us to be able to understand what's the context that led to where Zimbabwe ended up. Because if you know that Mugabe is behaving badly, but you also know how he got there, then it changes your entire understanding of what Zimbabwe is about. So I think that in terms of doing this, there is no way we are going to reshape the narrative about Africa until we Africans are writing about ourselves, until we Africans begin to consume news that is not entirely coming from external sources. Now, some of the people I've had the most difficult discussions with since I came out of Eritrea and wrote differently about it are fellow Africans. 2 years down the road, I'm still arguing with people, fellow academics, about Eritrea, because for them, Eritrea is the monster, Isaias, and oh, these poor Eritreans who are leaving their country because they're being oppressed, and nothing else. Anything else doesn't matter. What matters is what the BBC is saying about Eritrea, what the New York Times is saying about Eritrea. So
that speaks to the difficulty of shifting perspectives by people who are already feeding from...
Yes, so how you shift that without, say, sending... And when I came out of Eritrea, the stories I wrote them for the East African newspaper, which is a regional newspaper. Now, I was lucky that I knew the editors, and so I was able to get that story into that newspaper. But I'm not sure, Mr. Rubin, you said write for a foreign audience. I'm not sure that a story about Eritrea that doesn't tell the normal quote-unquote story about Eritrea will get very easily into a Western newspaper that has been churning out negative articles over the last 20 years.
Okay. Goloba, thank you. Arthur, you've been sitting on the leadership of this association of public broadcasters. What kind of conversation goes on in terms of countering the narrative, or indeed helping to reshape narrative amongst your colleagues from around the African continent?
Yes, I serve on the committee of the African Union of Broadcasters. And we discuss these issues here. We quite often are talking about how we can amplify the African voice. And we've tried to put in some initiatives. We've created a platform where stories can be exchanged, as opposed to relying on international media outlets to tell our story. For example, if I have a story about tourism in Rwanda, I put a story on this platform, and my colleague in Senegal or Ghana or Nigeria or Togo can be able to pick the story instead of picking it from BBC or CNN. So that is the kind of initiatives we're putting in place, but they're still very minimal. They're still very minimal and, of course, uncapped by a lack of enough resources. But the conversation is there, and that's very important. One thing I wanted to add on in relation to what you had asked Goloba, especially about leadership, I think two things. One, at times we also need to accept and agree that the African bad story is because of we Africans. We're the source of the bad story. I mean, some countries have gotten governance completely wrong, poverty is rampant, all these terrible bad stories happening. When you look at what's happening in Central African Republic, look at what's happening in Chad, look at what's happening in Libya. So I tend not to shift the blame to people out of this continent, but also ourselves. We need to agree that some of the bad stories told about Africa are because of us. Then the other thing is you need to look at the role of multilateral or international NGOs. And Juliana, I don't mean the likes of UNICEF and but international NGOs and even UN agencies. You see, for these people to mobilize resources, they're not mobilizing resources based on a good story. Okay, sometimes they do. But for them to attract the attention, the passion, the sympathy of funders out there, the best way they portray the story is bring a child with mucus or malnourished or, some impoverished family in Africa. That, in the mind of these friends of ours in international media, international NGOs, is a way of attracting resources, funding. And so, as long as the international NGOs are also controlled in the Western capitals, I don't see us changing the narrative. But by and large, yes, much as these issues exist, I think we as the Africans also need to blame ourselves for the bad story that's being told about us. There are areas we have messed up. There are bad stories that come out from many of our countries, and they give an opportunity for our colleagues to report about them.
Thank you, Arthur. Dr. Rugira, you are to blame, according to Arthur. Do you agree?
Well, I partly agree with Arthur when he talks about the international NGOs and the reproduction of a certain narrative about Africans. Yeah, of course, when that narrative is reproduced, the relevance of the NGOs is much easier understood. Because if you are saying that Africans are living normal lives and that they are facing similar struggles as anywhere in the rest of the world, then the NGOs are needed everywhere else in the world, not just in Africa. So to be able to make Africa different or exceptional, that narrative is important so that the NGOs get disproportionately deployed to Africa. That is logical. I agree. Now, the part about Africans playing a role, somehow I agree as well. And this is where I agree. The African journalist knows that if they are hired at BBC or CNN, Washington Post, they know that they are not there to give the African perspective. They know the quickest way to get fired is to trying to bring the African perspective. You are there to reproduce the narrative the way it is. You are there to, if you're hired as an African, what power do you have to go there and reshape the editorial line of the Washington Post, of the BBC? An African who is there to secure their employment knows what Arthur is talking about, knows the role to play. When he says Africans will play a role. So now, if I'm an African journalist, I have to ask myself, should I refuse to take this job at the BBC where I'm going to reproduce the misrepresentation of Africa? Or should I leave the job and be jobless? That's a very practical question.
Having spent 20 years at the BBC, I disagree with what you're saying. I was the editor of two very prime products of the BBC, The Morning Show and Focus on Africa, as well as Focus on Africa magazine. Never in my entire life have I ever been told what to do or what not to do. There are structures within that make it difficult for you to tell the story you want to tell about Africa. And so the alternative, for example, Zimbabwe. If you listen to the BBC African Service on the reporting of Zimbabwe during Mugabe's days and the mainstream BBC, there were two different stories because we were speaking to an African audience, and you will not get away by telling a story that is quoted by anything else other than what is authentic to the African. And because I chose to walk, I wasn't fired. So I wanted to say it is possible to do your job, professional job within a professional organization. You may not change much, but at least you can serve the African audience. And just maybe to give you a sense of how difficult it was when I took over, there were very few African reporters working on African programs, and that was my job to try and Africanize the reporting of it. And the argument that persisted was their English is not so good, it will not be understood. My argument was, but they are speaking to fellow Africans. If I am speaking to a Nigerian, it's my job to understand him, and he too will have to understand my funny Kenyan accent. And the BBC did not put up any resistance. In fact, it was actually seen as a good thing, because then the reporting of Africa was a little bit more authentic. So I just want to chip in there, because Arthur is trying to do it.
All right. When you are speaking as an experienced reporter, journalist, who is in a place that they can make a decision, and who understands that they have alternatives, that's different from the ordinary young journalist who's looking for, so is likely going to toe the line, and the influence that they are not going to start at the position you started at, for instance. They're going to start as reporters who understand that their influence is very minimal. And to add to that, recently when the BBC, the BBC expansion in Nairobi, when they opened the Africa Bureau and they hired many of these up-and-coming African journalists, actually a few of them from Rwanda as well, some of the shining stars, the foreign policy role they were going to play in the British machine was the rise of the Chinese on the African continent. And the British countered the rise of the Chinese by hiring more Africans for the BBC Bureau. And this is what I'm talking about. I'm talking about this African who is hired to reinforce the threat of the Chinese vis-a-vis the British is not going to BBC in Nairobi to push an African agenda. It's going to push a British agenda. And this is where we started from. Jeffrey Sachs was on BBC recently, and he was slamming the BBC for ignoring Western human rights abuses when they report about China, because they say the Western media is always talking about the Chinese abuse of human rights, but they never talk about the Western abuse of human rights. But as experienced as Jeffrey Sachs is, he's ignoring the role of the perspective to which the BBC is there. BBC is not there to accuse the West of human rights abuses. If the West in a geostrategic competition with the Chinese, the tool that they have is the BBC to amplify the human rights abuses of the Chinese, not to amplify the Western human rights abuses. So when Jeffrey Sachs talks about the media not being objective and ignoring Western human rights abuses, is also not understanding this thing.
Mr. Rubin wants to come in briefly.
Let me make a last very short. In 2019, the media, a report came out, it was a scandal apparently, that in Britain, there's the D-Notice Committee. The D-Notice Committee had journalists, editors, who sit with the intelligence community. The intelligence, British intelligence and the editors, they sit and they determine the important news that should come out. And this is the D-Notice Committee. If you Google this, you'll find out. And this was a scandal that came out in 2019 when it was revealed to the world that the media that is supposed to be objective and independent and so meets with the intelligence community, and editorial decisions are made together. So the African media is very far from the kind of practical media we're talking about.
The only thing I would add, I'm glad you brought up the Jeffrey Sachs issue, because it does actually highlight the importance of journalism, because many journalists looked at the recent donations which Sachs's Institute had received from the Chinese prior to his having gotten on the media and started talking about why the genocide against the Uyghurs wasn't that. But putting that aside, and that just shows the importance of the media for elucidating more dark corners, where I would quibble with you a little bit is simply because I don't see narratives as completely ossified. Oftentimes they are subconscious, and this is where there's such a great importance, not just on traditional journalism, but on opinion journalism as well, on the battle of the editorial pages and so forth. And I always liken it to drops of water in a bucket to change perspectives. But eventually that bucket fills and it starts to spill over. So if we look at the example of Rwanda, and when it comes to, for example, the traditional narratives which have obscured the nature of the anti-Tutsi genocide, we're starting to see through opinion journalism. We saw a great piece in the New York Times Magazine, for example. The fact that more information is coming out, more people are taking notice. The Muse report is going to have tremendous long-term implications, and ultimately it's leading to President Macron coming later this month to Rwanda, presumably to apologize the way that Kofi Annan once did. And so if people keep hammering away at the narratives, eventually that impacts what may be conventional but false, and I agree with you on that, conventional but false assumptions that permeate some newsrooms.
Okay, thank you.
I think Michael makes a very important point. But the problem you have, Michael, is, luckily we get a person like you who is ready to understand, ready to learn, ready to research and find out the truth. But there's a critical mass out there of powerful individuals, renowned writers, renowned authors, who have a mindset that is completely difficult to change. And they command a great opinion in the publications you've been talking about. So penetrating and fighting these powerful individuals is extremely difficult. And getting hold of open-minded individuals like you is also difficult. So I think my question is, how do you really navigate through this painful process of trying to sell your story to a few that might want to listen to it, but also fighting these authorities that have a strong voice in these platforms?
And that segues nicely for us into trying to find solutions beyond dismantling international media, a lot of it which predates even independent Africa. What about our own solutions? And that's why I want to start with Goloba. How do we move the discussion forward in reality? What are the challenges along the way that we need to unblock in terms of finding solutions for crafting the kind of narrative that serves the African interest?
Again, Joseph, I really don't think that there are easy solutions here. We have been talking for years, and this, at least my recollection of this is it dates from even when I was a teenager. And I'm no longer, I'm now middle-aged. We have been talking of establishing our own media in Africa. It's a recurring theme. And I don't know how we begin to do this. When Al Jazeera came into being, I remember waves of excitement going through some sections of Africans who were saying, oh, well, at least now we have Al Jazeera. They're going to feed us on something different from what Western media have been feeding us on. It hasn't happened, or at least it happened for a short period of time, but now it seems like Al Jazeera has been colonized by, again, conventional people who, as Michael Rubin said, are probably just too lazy to look for the real stories. We thought that Al Jazeera would give us an example of what Africa could do, but Al Jazeera was founded by Qatar, a country, but we are a continent. And how, as a continent, we go about founding our own media houses or a media house, that's a difficult question. Even we Africans are we do tend to get divided in ways that are surprising to me. For instance, if you hear stories about what goes on at the AU in terms of making critical decisions for Africa, the contestations that happen there, you will find Francophone countries thinking one thing and Lusophone countries thinking one thing and Anglophone countries thinking one thing. Now, I think that we will not be able to come up with a solution until all of us Africans, and I'm actually talking about our leaders, realize that this is an important issue to which they should devote time and energy. Look what is happening with regard to COVID. I mean, COVID has sparked off conversations in Africa that maybe 2 years ago we would not have been able to have, which is now about how do we Africans begin to manufacture vaccines? How do we manage to make our own medical supplies? Now, this has happened because COVID came, and COVID has become a threat to our own existence. Now, finally, leaders, led by a few very determined individuals like President Kagame, are now beginning to have the right conversations. What is it that is going to shock us into finally having a focused conversation about setting up or establishing media in Africa that seek to report on Africa in the way that reflects what is actually going on, not only on the ground, but also in our minds. But we need to also look a bit beyond media and look at academia. For instance, the conversations we have on this continent about democracy and democratization, what are they informed by? They are informed by what many of us go and learn elsewhere. And we bring back here and want to apply on or in our societies unmodified. And I no longer teach, but when I used to teach at university, I thought that one of the biggest challenges we had, for instance, I'm a political scientist, and we are the people who teach young people about things like democracy. How do we teach about these things? We give the impression that there is such a thing as democracy that is a single thing, unchangeable. Democracy looks like this, and if it's not like this, then it's not democracy. And in my thinking, I thought that we actually have a big challenge of changing the curriculum, teaching things differently, thinking about things differently, but also going away and learning things, bringing them back here, and not just seeking to apply them the way they are, but modify them to fit the context. So even we need to think beyond media, go into academia and say, okay, how do we teach certain things to young Africans who are going to grow up, who are going to be responsible for leading this continent? How are they thinking about certain things?
Okay. Thank you, Goloba. Now, Regina, let me turn to you. I'm looking for some sunshine because I had a lot of disillusionment on this side. Where do we begin the shift, if it can be done? And is the answer necessarily with the external players, the external media, or can solutions come from within?
No, actually, the external media is not an answer, it's a problem. We are looking for answers so that we can reduce the influence of the external media, so it cannot be a solution. The solution, as far as I'm concerned, is threefold. One has to do with what Goloba said. Our political leadership needs to see the media as essential for security. Without this understanding, the media will continue to be a tool for destabilization. And once this understanding is made, then we need to understand. This understanding will be able to shape the knowledge that within our media fraternity, what is missing is not journalism skills. What is missing is political education. Our media people need political education. 3 is to build a critical mass of media practitioners who have the requisite political education. And once we have those three things in place, the resources for investing in such a media will be available because it will be a priority. And it will be resources well invested. Because as it is today, taking money and putting it in the media without these steps is misallocating money, and that could be used for other key areas.
Arthur, let me turn to you. Maybe when you talk about the African narrative, perhaps this is too huge an elephant. Is the answer perhaps, or part of the solution, unpacking these into national narratives? And by this, I'm looking at the example of Rwanda. I remember many years ago, I came here from the BBC to do a story on the digitization of government when ministers were attending cabinet meetings now with iPads and things like that. And that's the story we told, which went down very well. The kind of stories that we're consuming of Rwanda in Kenya are stories of cleanliness, development, the technology hub. Those are the kind of things that we are consuming. It's not obviously that the 94 narrative has died away, but those are the kind of stories that fellow Africans are hearing, which to me says it is possible, maybe within a national context, to begin to tell these stories. And by the narrative, we actually mean stories that matter to the people and change lives. Your thoughts?
No, I think I agree with you 100%. I agree with you entirely. That we need to keep amplifying these stories that are positive, that are showing the good things that are happening here on the continent. But I'll turn to, let me say two things. One, I don't entirely agree with Dr. Lonzen that we need to train our journalists in political science or political education. Maybe I'll say, maybe I think it's written. Maybe it's to do with national interests. That our journalists should know what constitutes their national interests. Because, like you all know, CNN will not show their soldiers wounded or injured in a battlefield in Afghanistan or Iraq. Not because these things happen, but because they know showing an American soldier bleeding is terrifying. It can bring down governments. The BBC will not talk about scandals in the royal family. I think you saw recently what happened when Prince Harry and the wife tried to create some chaos. You saw the amount of bashing they received from the British media. Some of the renowned journalists in Britain even had to resign. So what I'm trying to say is that, everything is done within the context of your national interests. And the problem we have with our journalists is that some of them, because of the mode of training we get, you're supposed to be independent, impartial, balanced, those, theoretical things we get. But at the end of the day, when your society is bleeding, you're not left behind. So this is a kind of constant training that we need to give our journalists. Then, finally, media is a business. Media consumes a lot of money. If we are to tell our own story as Africans, we need to seriously think about how to invest in our media. It's consuming. You're talking about Al Jazeera. Al Jazeera gets about $600 million every year. $600 million every year to spend. The Voice of America, that does not broadcast in America, but broadcast out of America because they want to sell. Ambassador Peter has left. Because they want to sell. They sell their story. They all sell their narrative to the Africans. Is financed to the tune of $78 million every year to just broadcast out of the US. Russia today, Russians have become also sophisticated, has about $300 million that they spend every year to promote Russia today. So, if we don't think of investing heavily, strategically, in this area, then the African story will keep being down there. And I don't think even the private sector can do it. I don't think the rich Dangotes of Africa can do it, because that's a lot of money. But it must be a concerted effort either by the African Union or by the African governments to think of how to, build or create a strong platform that can be able to, to fight or compete with these other big brands. Otherwise, if you don't do that, then Reshaping Africa's Narrative will talk about it from January to January until cows come home. Thank you.
Thank you. A quick thought from you, Mr. Rubin, then I'm going to open the floor for questions. Any thoughts? Yeah.
In every part of the world, media gets criticized for blood and violence selling and for them ignoring the good news stories. That said, when we look at Africa over the last 20, 25 years, or more broadly, when we look at the world, there's been tremendous progress. More than 2 billion people have been lifted out of poverty by largely free market reforms in both in East Asia and in Africa, and that's starting to reflect in the differences in narratives which we have today versus what we had 25 years ago. What I would argue and of course Rwanda in terms of its entrepreneurial spirit is at the forefront of this. And when we look at companies like Zipline, for example, and what they've achieved, what I would argue is that there is always going to be frustration that the press doesn't accurately reflect progress, but ultimately the press will catch up with reality, and that part of that progress is dependent upon maintaining that commitment to entrepreneurial spirit, to business operating, because the more business that operates, the more that people are able to interact with each other without having the journalists or media companies have to act as the intermediary, the more reality does start to reflect across.